Welcome to Balkans Debrief. My name is Ilva Tare. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. The situation between Kosovo and Serbia is deeply troubling. The recent murder of a police officer by a Serbian gunman in north of Kosovo is a stark reminder of the fragility of peace and security in the region. The EU-led dialogue for normalization has reached a dead end, and there is a growing sense of urgency for a different response from the international community. A vocal voice on asking about this more robust international response is my guest today, Alicia Kearns, a British Member of Parliament and Chair of Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you, Alicia, for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
On September 24th, as you have followed and I have seen your statements, a criminal attack was carried out against the Kosovar police patrol in northern Kosovo by Kosovar Serbs led by Milan Radojicic. Radojicic is currently in Serbia and being investigated there and has taken full responsibility for the attack. How do you assess the responses from the EU, the US and the UK to the Serbian government's role in this criminal attack in north of Kosovo?
So I think what you have seen is the international community obviously wanting to work off the basis of evidence and facts, and they've been very keen to get to the bottom of ascertaining exactly what happened. But we know now what happened. We know that he has taken responsibility, and the problem is that we haven't seen as yet him return to Kosovo. It is absolutely vital that he sees justice in Kosovo. The daughter of the Kosovan police officer who was murdered, watching her do her press conference was absolutely heartbreaking, and she deserves to face him in court and to be able to have her say. There has obviously been a particularly strong response in the UK, where we've deployed the 1st Battalion Princess of Wales Regiment as part of our commitment to KFOR. That means that we now have a few more hundred troops based in Kosovo. That is the right thing to do. But more broadly, we seem to have fallen into the same pattern that we do repeatedly with Serbia, whereby there is an escalation and then there is no response from the international community. And I think it's deeply frustrating to see that Kosovo remains under sanctions from the EU. Meanwhile, there have been no repercussions despite the fact that Serbia has not handed over those responsible for the murder and the attacks those days to Kosovo. And the reality is that we have worse even seen Serbia declare days of national mourning for those terrorists who perpetrated these atrocities within Kosovo. That is unacceptable, and there are worrying parallels in the language that's being used by Vučić and others compared to what Putin used in the Donbass and Crimea.
But how can the EU respond to Serbia if it is unable to reach a unanimous decision for consequences or sanctions against Belgrade due to potential members' veto? Will bilateral measures or sanctions be sufficient to hold Serbia's leadership accountable, in your view? And is also UK considering any sanctions against Serbia?
So the EU has a duty to talk to those 5 non-recogniser countries and to push them to recognise Kosovo. Kosovo is an independent and sovereign nation. This is not up for debate, and anyone who is supporting Serbia by refusing to recognise Kosovo's independence clearly is supporting irredentist foreign policy. That is not one that is acceptable, and we can see exactly what has happened in Russia, where you have similar countries behaving in a way that is utterly unacceptable. The EU should look to these non-recognising countries, and they should be telling them to recognise Kosovo. I do think it is possible for countries to put in place bilateral sanctions, but if we have already seen unity from the EU on putting sanctions on Kosovo, then surely if the EU believes in balance and equal treatment, we need to see sanctions as we see more detail come out. I mean, at the moment, obviously, one of the key issues we need to get to the bottom of is exactly how these weapons got into Kosovo, who brought them across, and whether any of them are Serbian military weapons.
In your view, Alicia, what are the root causes of the deterioration of relations between Serbia and Kosovo? Since the Ohrid Agreement was signed following the Franco-German proposal, what should have been done differently to prevent another conflict in European soil? Images of the War of the 90s are still vivid in the minds of people in the region, and conflicts also around Europe. You have Ukraine and now Israel. So how urgent do you see the role of international community in the Western Balkans to prevent these countries from returning to armed conflict?
So the duty of the international community is enormous, particularly when it comes to Kosovo and particularly for the UK, where we have a particular historic commitment and duty to make sure that Kosovo is a success. The core of the problem is a failure of deterrence diplomacy, the continuation of the 1990s Belgrade-centric foreign policy of the UK, the US and the EU, and a failure to recognise that Serbia is not meaningfully engaging in any of these processes. Look, the Ohrid Agreement, it was verbally agreed. In that agreement, Serbia agreed to stop blocking Kosovo's entrance into international organisations, to recognise more Kosovan documents, and the Kosovo agreed to implement the Association of Serb Municipalities. Since that agreement happened, Vučić then went on TV and said his hand was broken and his hand would continue to be broken or have a pain for the next 4 years, meaning that he would not sign those agreements. Serbia then tried to block Kosovo joining the Council of Europe, and of course, Serbia also engaged in foreign interference in Kosovo's domestic elections. When it comes to the international criticism, however, it all appears to be for Kosovo, who, yes, have not yet introduced the Association of Serb Municipalities, but in my discussions with Prime Minister Kurti, he knows exactly what the plan is, he has a plan for doing so, and he does not appear to me to be refusing to do so. So why is Kosovo under sanctions from the EU? Why was Kosovo kicked out of a joint military exercise with the US while Serbia was not? Negotiations cannot move forward unless the international community takes an equitable and fair approach. And that is why earlier this year, along with, I think, about 12 other chairs of foreign affairs committees from around the world, and with around 60 MPs from around Europe, we called for the EU, the US and the UK to take a more balanced approach. We are not taking one side or the other. We are saying that we need to have balance and fairness, and the current approach is not working. And that is quite evidenced by the continued escalations that we see.
As you mentioned, the Association of Serbian Municipality is still on the table, and a request from the international community. So far, should the Prime Minister Kurti do a better job to convince the international community that he intends to implement the ASM?
Look, I think it's really important that Prime Minister Kurti makes very clear that he is meaningfully engaged in this process. He is listening, he is taking part, he is not pushing back. But I think there's a real problem in which the EU expects our only democratic partner in this process, and that is Kosovo, who have done everything we have asked them when it comes to Ukraine, who have joined with us in sanctions, which Serbia has not, who are valid members of the international community. They are the ones being punished. Yes, an association of Serb municipalities, as much as I do not necessarily personally think that is the right approach, and personally I do not believe it is the right thing for Kosovo, that is what has been agreed to. Kosovo has been clear they will uphold this request. But it is important it doesn't become a new Republika Srpska, that it does not become a new organisation undermining the Kosovan state from within. So the priority has to be getting ethnic Serbs re-engaged in Kosovo's democracy and back into the police. We know from Northern Ireland and the UK how important it is to have a intermixed police force. I believe that Kurti is committed to that. I want to see him bring forward with it. But I will also point out that I think I'm one of the few European politicians who has also challenged Mr. Kurti in person to say what is he doing to make sure that Kosovo Serbs in the north feel part of the country of Kosovo. What's he doing to support them and make sure that they have a voice and they feel represented by his government?
Do you think it's a high time to engage the 5 EU non-recognizers in a way to help Kosovo by recognizing its sovereignty? That, of course, that will help the Kosovo's trajectory towards EU and the NATO membership.
Absolutely. Those 5 non-recognisers, the EU needs to engage with them, needs to engage those non-recognising members, because as a leading, well, essentially as the arbiter of the normalisation dialogue, they have responsibility to look internally and make sure that is happening. What I'm also really pleased by is that the statement I put out a few months ago, the Ukrainian chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee also signed it. And only a few days ago, you heard him speaking in Parliament in support of Kosovo. So if we can see Ukraine already having that discussion, recognising that Kosovo could be an important partner to them. Zelensky again met with the president of Kosovo only a few days ago. I hope that we can see the 5 non-recognisers recognise that whilst their non-recognition is not about Kosovo, it is about their own domestic politics. It is wrong for them not to recognise Kosovo, and it feeds the autocratic views of some, and it feeds the rhetoric of those who wish to cause more division within Europe.
And what is your vision? How do you see what I said earlier at the beginning of our conversation? The EU-led dialogue for normalization has reached a dead end. What future can the dialogue for normalization have? Is the EU-led dialogue still possible? If not, what are the alternatives?
Look, we need a peaceful Balkans. We need a Balkans where the countries are ideally in the EU. That is the vision that most people within the Balkans want. We need to see the EU reward good behaviour and punish bad behaviour. It is basic fairness that we need to see in even-handedness. What I do think we need, however, is for the UK to find its backbone and as a member of the Quint play a more active role in those talks. I am very frustrated by the fact that the UK has not been a major player within those. The dialogue should be between the UK, the US and the EU. And I hope we can get back on track. I can hope we can have the right incentives and consequences. And I hope we can see meaningful willingness from both sides to engage.
And meanwhile, no, it's not only Kosovo in this situation, it's Serbia as well. What can Serbia take, any specific steps to accelerate its progress on the European path? To what extent do you really believe that Serbia is currently fulfilling its obligations towards the EU accession process? Should alignment on the foreign and security policy be a condition to continue the EU membership?
So Serbia needs to make a choice and its future is in its hands. Serbia's path domestically, sadly, currently, and also on foreign policy suggests a divergence from European policies and European values, not least when you look at foreign policy, where it is the only EU accession country who has not joined up to sanctions against Russia, given its illegal renewed invasion of Ukraine. This increased authoritarianism at home, the deeper stabilisation both in Bosnia and Kosovo, these need to be challenged with clear consequences that impact on Serbia's accession into the EU. I believe that Serbia's best future is within the EU. I believe that's what the majority of people in Serbia want. But we do need to see that unity and coming together. We do need to see EU values being exhibited. And the EU has stated it wants more of a foreign policy and security power as its future, in which case these countries need to show that they can align with those visions and values.
And meanwhile, since we're talking about the sanctions that Serbia has not fully aligned with the EU and the international community on Russia, what role do you believe Russia or its proxies have currently in the region, and namely even in the recent conflict between Serbia and Kosovo? What do you think are the risks of a potential destabilization of the region?
We should be very alert to the risk of Russia, specifically Putin, having an interest in stoking instability in the Balkans, not least to distract from its illegal renewed invasion of Ukraine, but also in terms of achieving its ambitions and keeping Serbia within its what it perceives to be its realm and sphere of influence. It is really important that we recognise that, for example, the EUFOR mandate in Bosnia is coming up for renewal in November. It's really important. Russia has a veto. We need them not to exercise that veto because that could be a real problem. But at the same time, if they were to, I don't think they will veto it, because if they did, there would be a likelihood of a NATO-led peacekeeping mission coming in its place. We really need to be alert to the risk of Russian disinformation within the Balkans, and we need to make sure that we as the UK do everything we can to support a clean and open and challenging media environment. But yes, I think we're all very alert to the risk of Russian meddling within the Balkans.
And can I have your assessment on China's influence in the region? Are you concerned about its role in the Western Balkans?
So China has a very different interest in the Balkans to Russia, but China is gaining increased significance economically. So, for example, its Belt and Road investments in Montenegro have left Montenegro saddled with significant debt to the Chinese government. This is a pattern that we are seeing globally that we do not want to see continue to be played out. The Chinese funded a so-called kind of mega highway in Montenegro, and that saw debt rise to 100% of GDP, which obviously seriously compromises the country's finances. If the EU wants to make sure that the Balkans countries in general do not begin to engage more generously or more significantly with China, it's really important that the EU itself steps up to fill that void.
And last question, how do you envision the future of the Western Balkans? Are you optimistic for their EU path and a speedy accession negotiations now that looks like the Ukraine war has created a new dynamic, a new momentum for the enlargement?
There is enormous momentum, and look, anyone who has spent any time in the Balkans, whether that be Belgrade or Pristina or Sarajevo or any other part of the Balkans, falls in love with it, falls in love with the people, the history, the food, the culture, the hospitality and the natural beauty. There is a real opportunity now for the Balkans to move forward with its Euro-Atlantic aspirations. I am fully supportive of that. I want to see a stable, peaceful and happy Balkans, one where we do not see the ethnic tensions of the past. We do not see the hatred and division of the past. We do need to deal with some core issues that affect many of those countries, such as corruption. We need to be able to heal and move past conflicts of the past, but that also requires some honest conversations to recognise those actions and those who've perpetrated crimes in the past. But I think the shoots of hope are absolutely there, and the Balkans has a really bright future to look forward to. And I hope that the UK can play its part in supporting the people of the Balkans to have that bright future that you so much deserve.
And it's beautiful, as an Albanian-born journalist, it's amazing to hear a British saying these things about the Western Balkans and the Balkans in general. Thank you very much for your contribution and for being a vocal voice on the most pressing issues in the region. Thank you, Alicia Kearns.
Thank you for having me.